Hi, everyone. Welcome. Annabelle, Talent Coordinator at BioBuzz. So I'm thrilled today to have our amazing guest, Juli McDonald. We're super excited to have her here. Welcome.
Thank you. Super excited to be here. Just to give you all a little background about what we're going to be talking about today. So our topic is harnessing the power of storytelling and interviewing. And so we'll go through just some different things to think about as we craft those interview stories, why they're important, how to make them quote unquote stick. And so before we dive in, I just wanted to give you a little background about me. So my name is Juli. I have been a career counselor / coach for going on 8 or 9 years at this point. So it's been a minute. And so I used to do this work full time for about 7 years. I've worked with a bunch of different populations. I started my career working with folks who are interested in going into graduate admissions for highly selective healthcare and life sciences programs such as medical school, PhDs, OT, PT, PAs, all that fun stuff. And then I transitioned over to working with folks in those careers and helping them figure out what their next moves were, their next steps, and where they wanted to grow as those types of professionals, or if they wanted to transition into a different area. Currently, I actually work in the life sciences as well. I work for an animal health organization. And so we make pharmaceuticals for animals, which is pretty cool. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through our presentation together. So I want to start with a little story. That's our topic for today. I'm just going to warn you, it's a little spooky. I figured I would lean into the spooky October vibes. I live in Philadelphia, and they are very, very apparent here. This area loves this time of year, so hopefully you enjoy. So one evening, a man was driving home along a long deserted road after attending a late night event in town. The night was quiet and a light fog had begun to settle in, making it hard to see far ahead. As he drove along the winding road, he suddenly noticed a young woman standing by the side, her thumb outstretched for a ride. She was wearing a pale dress, simple yet elegant, which stood out in the dim light. The man hesitated for a moment. Picking up strangers at night wasn't something he usually did, but she looked very cold and desperate. Deciding to help, he pulled over and rolled down the windows. "Do you need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded silently and got into the back seat without saying much. She seemed shy, keeping her gaze down. After a few moments of silence, the man tried to make conversation. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road," she replied softly, pointing towards a distant house, barely visible through the fog. The man nodded, relieved that it wasn't too far. They continued driving in silence. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, occasionally noting how strangely she sat, her pale skin illuminated faintly by the dashboard lights. Despite the oddness, nothing seemed too alarming, and before long they approached the house she had just pointed out. As they neared the driveway, the man turned around to ask if this was her shop. But to his shock, the back seat was empty. The woman had completely vanished without a trace. Startled and confused, the man pulled over and got out, looking around but finding no sign of her. Unsure of what to do, he decided to knock on the door of the house. An older woman answered, her face lined with years of sorrow. The driver hesitantly explained what had happened, describing the young woman and how she had disappeared. The older woman listened quietly, and when he finished, she nodded sadly. "That was my daughter," she said softly. "She died in a car accident on this very road many years ago. You're not the first to give her a ride." The man stopped in stunned silence, chills running down his spine. The fog thickened around him as he made his way back to the car. Shaken but strangely at peace, he had helped her get home, even if only for a moment. So I always think, one, this is an urban legend. As you saw the title, and maybe as I started going, I think probably some of you were like, "Oh, I may have heard this story before. I may have heard versions of this story before." And what I want you to note is why that why you may have remembered this story, right? Like when I was looking for pieces for this, I was immediately like, "Oh, I know this one." So why, in all the thousands and thousands and thousands of stories that we hear throughout our lives, do some of them stay with us and some of them immediately come into our head and leave? It'd be great if things like academic information from classes or interview question examples would just stick so well. So that's what I want to talk about today. Why do some things stick and why do some things just fall right out? So again, we had our first story. We're going to talk about what makes a story sticky, interviewing as storytelling, 2 different methods, and then some final tips and takeaways. And then we'll leave some time for questions as well. Okay. So interviewing is storytelling. When would we do this, right? Anytime you're given a behavioral interview question, so your biggest tip off that you'd want to use a story would be anything that starts with the phrase, tell me about a time. If you're not answering that question with a story, you are missing an opportunity to really lean into the power and the psychology behind stories and how they can help us as interview candidates really stand out and be memorable as you go through the process. But that's not the only time that I would recommend using a story, right? Sometimes there's what I call sneaky opportunities. So question that strengths and weaknesses, I'm sure we've all had to answer that question at some point. Those are two prime opportunities to use a story, to use an example, for the interviewer to get to know you in a format that's going to make them remember you. Why should we hire you? Also an opportunity to sneak a story in. We'll talk about the funnel method, but start with something broad, your broad traits, and then funnel down into a specific story or example. And then lastly, scenario questions. These are sneaky because they sound like they should just be hypotheticals, but they're also an opportunity to, again, sneak in a story and use that psychology of storytelling to our advantage. So what makes them stick, right? How do we know a story is going to be impactful and powerful? And so these are 5 different ways that you can start to infuse what we know psychologically as stickiness into these stories, right? And create that memorable experience for the person you're interviewing with. So first and foremost, we want to keep our stories simple. Simplicity is really the idea of aiming for the core of what you're trying to get to as you're telling these stories about yourself. So there's a couple different models, and we'll go through 2 at the end, STAR and the funnel method, that really keep you on theme and task and keep the story you're telling clean, concise, clear, and organized. It's also important to be concrete along this tenet, right? So concreteness means that we're not being abstract about what we're talking about. And I see this a lot when I work with clients. I always tell them you're speaking in generalities, right? Like you're saying things like, well, I always do X, Y, and Z, instead of giving me a specific example of a time you did X, Y, and Z, right? And part of why we do that is when we're an expert in something, like our own career and our own lives, we'll often speak in that abstract voice because we know so well our own experiences. So I would remind you to keep it simple and concrete for someone who hasn't lived your own experience. They're not an expert in your career the way you are. If you don't tell them, they won't know. So tell them very clearly. Next, we want to think about credibility. So we use stories to create that credibility, that evidence in an interview by having examples with details. We create that evidence for a stranger who needs to believe what we say we can do, right? And that we can do it well. So one of the examples I use a lot when I work with folks is the astronaut example, which is I can tell you I'm an astronaut. I can write it down all over my materials, but unless I can give you a time, a specific story that I went to space, why would you believe me, right? And so it's just a very common psychological thought process when we are talking to a stranger and trying to convince them, hey, we would be great at what we say we're going to be great at. The next one that I think is an interesting way to think about your interview stories, but I would encourage you to think about, is unexpectedness, right? So choose stories that are a little unexpected or surprising. I think one of the reasons The Vanishing Hitchhiker tends to stick with people over time is that it is a little unexpected. There's a little mystery at the end, a little surprise. Our brains are constantly trying to figure out solutions and to see if we can predict an ending or an outcome, right? So if we hear the same thing over and over again, we're going to naturally tune out and we're going to go, oh yes, I've heard this answer before, right? Great example is if I say to someone, tell me a weakness, and you tell me you're a perfectionist. Part of why that's a bad answer, and there's many reasons, but part of why is because I know that answer like the back of my hand. I've heard it a million times. Every candidate gives me that answer, right? So it's better to pick something that is a little unexpected or that I can't naturally predict. Same thing if someone asks you, tell me about a time you had a conflict at work. Tell me about a time you struggled with something. These are opportunities to maybe not pick the most obvious route so that your interviewer remembers what you said and is actually invested in hearing the ending of that story. It's not, they can't predict it, right? And mysteries are really powerful because they also create what we call a need for closure. So humans are naturally super curious. It's what we call the curiosity gap. And so whenever we have something that we don't know the answer to, it almost feels a little itchy and we want to know, what is the answer? Why can't I figure that out? So you can use that to your advantage when you are telling these unexpected stories, knowing that psychologically people want to know how something ends. It's the same reason that we have movie trailers and that we also have the nightly news or those news articles on Yahoo, right? They don't give you the whole story, they just give you the headline. So you can also use that in the tell me about yourself question, right? That should be a highlight reel of things that you want to dig into deeper, and it should prime the interviewer's attention and get them excited to want to learn more about you. The next one is sensory details. In the hitchhiker example that we just talked about, there were loads and loads of sensory details in there. And again, that's oftentimes why stories stick with people, because we are storytellers. We want to remember those details. If you think of proverbs or fairy tales or things you probably heard as a kid, the ones that stick with you most likely have more of those sensory details. So use that to your advantage in your interview stories, right? Consider when those details are relevant and how you can create a full picture for your audience in a memorable way. For example, I had a client probably 5 years ago at this point, but I never forgot her story. She was telling me about a patient. She was a nurse, and she had a specific patient who had gone through brain surgery. And in that example, the patient just wanted someone to wash her hair, but she couldn't because of the stitches. So instead, what she did is she told this beautiful story about how she went above and beyond for the patient and was literally picking the surgical glue out of her hair. And she had the hand gestures too. And so while this is a story that is beautiful and empathetic, really what I remember and why it sticks with me is that detail. I could visualize her doing that and went, wow, I could see her as my nurse on my floor, right? Which leads me to my last sticky story tenant, if you will, which is emotions, right? So that story, while it's very sensory, is a double hitter because it also hits on the emotions, right? I can picture this incredibly empathetic, heartwarming nurse doing this kind of work for me. And so emotions are a really basic way to help people find care and to form an association between something they don't know yet and something that they do care about, right? So if I'm the charge nurse on that floor, I care about my patient's success and I want them to feel, cared for on my floor, right? And so that story is showing me that that is a person who can do that kind of work, and I can visualize her in that, right? And she's tapped into something that I care about as the interviewer. So it's really important when you're telling those stories to think about, how you can tap into that. And also, some of us may be in more corporate settings, right? Sometimes that's a little challenging if we're doing more of the kind of work like I work in human resources, right? And so I'm on the fluffy side, but I have colleagues that work more on data and things like that. So I always say, as the interviewee, it is your job to find the emotion in the work that you do and highlight your passion for what you're interested in and how you are making a difference in your role for the company or the organization. And so I'll give you an example. My current organization, it's very easy for me to tell people, oh, I work in animal health. And I see them just kind of go, oh, yeah, that's nice. They don't really know what that is. So then I go a little further and I tell them, well, I work in animal health. We do what's called compounded medication, which is specific dosing for large zoo animals. Now I've piqued your interest a little bit. That's a little unexpected, right? You're thinking I make flea and tick medication for cats and dogs. And then I go a step further and I say, for example, most recently, we just made chemo for Blizzard the polar bear. And Blizzard made it through his chemotherapy, and he actually wrote us a letter, and he said thank you, and they put his little paw on it for one of the major zoos in the country. And now all of a sudden, I've given you sensory details, I gave you an unexpected answer, I kept it simple, and there was an emotional element to it. And that is how a story sticks. So I leave you with a little quote at the bottom from Dan Heath, who is the king of all of this. And if you like this stuff, I highly recommend checking out his work. But a credible idea makes people believe, an emotional idea makes people care, but the right stories make people act. And that's what you're looking for in an interview. You're looking for that final piece of action so that you get hired and get the job. So we talked a little bit about this already. I just wanted to touch on the star structure. So as you're crafting these stories, this is a super common method. If you've ever worked with your career center in college, they probably told you this, and it rings true. So if you're like, man, I have all these stories, but I have no idea how to structure them, or I tend to ramble, you can use either this method, the STAR method, which stands for situation, task, action, and result. And so basically just gives you a way to format those stories so that they are easy to understand. You can get from idea to idea, and it's not going to be super long or cumbersome, and naturally works on some of those tenets that we talked about. Or you can use what I call the funnel method, which is for probably people who are a little further in their career, like STAR might be a little bit more intuitive to you. So I would say this is also a great way to do it. And I tell people with your stories to start like a funnel, right? We start with the most broad, and then we come in and get more specific over time. So for example, start with a broad theme or strength about yourself. I've had many opportunities to lead the end-to-end implementation of a program throughout my career. And then we start to drill down to more specifics, creating that funnel, right? So example, more recently, I was the owner of a leadership development program for 200 plus people leaders. I've added some details, I've added some context. Go down even further. This program was underfunded when I started. Throughout my first 6 months, I worked with key stakeholders to increase buy-in and increased engagement from learners. The outcome was a sustainable program where new leaders thrived and seasoned leaders share their experience. And that's a good way to end. But the best way to end, again, tapping into some of the emotions, the specifics, the relevance that we talked about before, make sure you're tying it back to, and why does this matter to the interviewer, right? So the bottom of your funnel should be the most specific to the person you're talking to. This program decreased turnover at the new leader level, saving the company $50,000 in the first 2 quarters on hiring costs. I know retention is a key goal for your team, and I'm excited to bring that expertise to this open role. And all of a sudden, we've taken a story and we've brought it over to a very specific example that the manager feels like, wow, I can really see someone in this role. I can see someone solving this key problem for me. So a couple of just key tips and takeaways as we close out together. First question I get a lot is, how do I even come up with these stories? Where do I start, right? And these are a couple just suggestions that I've put together over the years for folks. One, keeping a quick story journal. So I like to use the Notes app in my phone. I like to throw a Google Doc together if I have a good day at work. Make sure that you're noting real time, or maybe put it on your calendar, something to do once a month or once a quarter, so that you don't forget all the great stuff that you've done that can be really juicy, sticky stories, right? Take a written note of interesting projects, accomplishments, and times when you went above and beyond. Again, they're really easy to slip out of our mind. I think it takes 10 positive experiences to outweigh 1 negative experience. So it's really easy for us to remember the things that don't go well, and really easy for us to forget the things that do. Keep a compliment journal. Note when supervisors say great things about you and your work. Performance reviews as we come up to the end of Q4 for a lot of us. That's going to be a great opportunity to get some of those moments of wisdom and compliments from your supervisor. So you can take note of that somewhere so you can use those. Also take notes of conflict or problems that you've solved. These can be compelling stories. You can kind of make them a little more mysterious, or capitalize on that curiosity gap if they are stories that have an unexpected ending, or just something that highlights how well you're solving these conflicts. And then use the bullets in the job description. So if you are looking through and you're like, oh, that reminds me of a time I did that. That reminds me of a time I did that. There's your stories right there. Write them out for yourself using STAR, the funnel method. And then lastly, write out those 10 accomplishments. I would say anytime you go on an interview, 5 to 10 key accomplishments are really what you want to have in your back pocket. Once you do that, so say you put together all these stories, this is a more advanced technique, but I do like to encourage people to think about themes, right? What are 3 to 5 skills or strengths that a manager should remember about you, that you see time and time again in these stories that you've chosen? And remember that concreteness tenet. Don't forget to hit them over the head with it. You know the themes you've put together. They don't know if you don't tell them. So make sure that you are highlighting that, yes, this is a consistent theme in the work that I do. I'm always a team player. I'm always well prepared. I always have great data management skills. My patients are always say I'm so empathetic. Like whatever your themes are, make sure you're just reminding them that this is a theme that you're coming back to. And there's a lot of places we can do that. And then when you send that thank you email, just reinforce those themes and call back to the interview itself. And then lastly, practice makes perfect. So I know, we practice for sports, we practice for instruments. We practice for a lot of different areas in our lives where we want to improve. And I would say interviewing is absolutely no different. And when I say practice, I literally mean say it out loud. I know it sounds creepy. Bear with me. The car is a great place if you're driving by yourself to just run through some stories and see if you like how they sound and play around with the language and think about, can I make it more sticky in one of those 5 ways, or does it flow the way I want it to flow? Does it make sense? Is it hitting the relevance for this particular job? But if you don't say it out loud, 2 reasons. One, your brain is going to cheat. It's going to say, oh, I know that. And it's going to, not hit any of the snags until you actually say it out loud in the big moment. And 2, when we are in a, really stressful situation with interviewing typically is, especially if we really want the job, right? It's no different than a big game for sports match. We really do rely on muscle memory. That's why athletes practice so much. So in the moment, they can automate some of the things that are going on. And it's the same concept with speaking out loud. You have to build that muscle memory, especially for questions that are going to be give me questions like, tell me about yourself. Why should I hire you? Strengths and weaknesses. These are things we can anticipate, and we can take some of that in the moment mental load off ourselves by having those answers in our back pocket. And that's it. Actually, before I close out, I'm just going to give you a little information and I'll take some questions. So thank you for your time and attention. I hope this is interesting. I hope you learned some fun stuff. But if you are interested in contacting me, this is my contact information here. You can find me on LinkedIn. Please feel free to add me. I always love to grow my network and to get to know everyone. You shoot me an email. And then if you are interested in working together in a coaching capacity, feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk to you more and learn more about you.